Okay, so we are doing Alexander the Great today. Let us review last class, where we discussed the father-son dynamic between Philip II and his son Alexander, okay? We said that the father, he is the founder and the builder of a great organization. And as such, he will have three particular characteristics unique to him, okay? First of all, he will exercise really good judgment because he's starting with nothing and he has to build up slowly his nation or his organization, okay? Second thing that we said is he will promote talent, okay? He will be a very generous and fair-minded individual who will actively spot talent and create a meritocracy, okay? And the third thing we said was this person will be selfless, extremely disciplined, and this person will put the greater good before his or her own interests, okay? And that will inspire loyalty from his or her workers or soldiers. We also said the son will be very different, okay? Because the son is inheriting this enterprise or this nation. The son will focus on expansion. The son will be a very aggressive risk taker, okay? Second characteristic of the son is because he is under the father's shadow, he will promote obedience and loyalty, okay? Promote loyalty. And the final characteristic, the final contrast between the father and son is the son will be very selfish because the son will be focused on personal glory. And the reason why is the son is insecure, right? The son will hear people in the background, in the shadows, whispering, oh, everything you've achieved is because of your father. And so the son is desperate, very anxious to prove his own self-worth, okay? So we see this dynamic in literature and in history, in our own lives, right? This is a very common dynamic. Now, we said that this is really a thought experiment, okay? But if you think about it, this is also an analytical model. It's a way to understand the world around us. And in an analytical model, we have to test if it's true or not. And if it's true, it does two things, okay? First thing it does is it explains. Does it help us better understand the motivations and behavior of people around us? In last class, we focused on Philip II, and that really helped us to understand his motivations and behavior, okay? Today, but the second thing it must do is predict. Okay, it has to predict the future. If this analytical model that we have is correct, then it will allow us to predict future events and behavior. Okay, and that's what I propose today. I propose to use this model to predict the life of Alexander the Great. Okay? So from this model, we can extrapolate three characteristics of Alexander's reign when he takes over as king. Okay? What's the first characteristic of Alexander when he becomes king? Okay? Echo, do you have any ideas of what he will do as king? Exactly, okay? So the first thing we will say is that he will focus on expansion. Okay? He'll be a very aggressive risk taker. He will take risks that are not strategically wise. Okay? That's the first prediction we can make about him. What's the second prediction we can make about him based on this? Exactly, and we call this a tyrant, okay? He's going to become a tyrant. And a tyrant is someone who demands obedience from everyone. Okay, does that make sense? And so if he's a tyrant, what is he going to do to all these talented people that his father promoted? He's going to kill them, right? Okay, he's going to get rid of them because he needs to promote his own people, and because these talented people will counter his tyranny. Okay, so we predict he will demand complete and total obedience from his followers. Okay, and what's the third prediction we can make about him? Well, the third prediction is that the question is, will he ever be happy? When will he stop his ambition? Never, okay? So his ambition is boundless. So these are the three predictions we can make about Alexander if he were to become king, just based on our understanding of the father-son dynamic, okay? The first is that he will focus on aggressive expansion. He will take risks that his father will not take. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is he's going to become a tyrant who will demand total loyalty and obedience from his followers. And if you, for his own good, speak up and try to reason with him, he will see you as a threat, as disloyal, and as an enemy who must be eliminated. Okay? The third prediction we can make is his ambition is boundless. He will never stop expanding. He will never stop going to war. Okay? These are the three predictions we can make based on this analytical model. Okay? And it turns out these three predictions basically capture the essence of Alexander's life. Okay? All right? So now I will slowly explain the life and times of Alexander the Great. All right. So, any questions so far? Okay. So we are using this analytical model to understand the life and times of Alexander the Great. And while we're doing this, we're trying to see if there are problems with this model. Okay. All right. So we have to take a very skeptical attitude. We have this prediction model. We're going to use it. We're going to apply it to Alexander the Great, and we're going to see that on the surface, it does actually capture well or explains well his life. But at the same time, we want to be generous and skeptical, okay? We want to ask ourselves, is it possible that we are blinded by our prejudice? And maybe we are being unfair to Alexander the Great, okay? Does that make sense? All right, so let's start with the first major event in Alexander the Great's life, which is the death of his father in 33 BCE, okay? And Alexander right now, he's only 20. And when his father dies, he is automatically coronated as king of the kingdom of Macedon. Now, I want to explain the circumstances of Philip's death, because it's very important for us to understand the sort of psychology of his son. So 2 years before his death, Philip actually remarried, okay? Now, remember that Macedon is a society that promotes polygamy, okay? So Philip, at this point, already has 6 or 7 wives. The problem is that only one of his wives, named Olympias, has given birth to a son and therefore a heir, okay? The son is Alexander. The other wives have failed to give birth to a heir. And it seems Alexander will be anointed king at the death of his father. So when Philip marries, her name is Cleopatra Eurydice, it's extremely controversial, okay? It sort of disrupts the political order of Macedonia. The first reason is Cleopatra Eurydice, she is actually Macedonian. Before, Philip married foreign wives for diplomacy reasons. And what this means is, if Cleopatra Eurydice gives birth to a son, this son will be more legitimate here than Alexander. And this pushes Alexander out of the line of succession, okay? So this is extremely controversial, and it's like dynamite almost, okay? So that's the first problem. Second problem is Eurydice is the wife of one of Philip's great generals, Attalus. Okay? And actually, at the wedding ceremony between Eurydice and Philip, Attalus gave a toast, and he said, here's a toast, and I pray that Macedon will soon have a legitimate heir. And this is a direct insult to Alexander, okay? The other problem is that Attalus, his father-in-law, is Parmenion, who is really Philip's partner, okay? The greatest general that Macedonia has, the person in control of the army, okay? So it seems like Alexander is being pushed out of the line of succession. And Alexander and his mother, Olympias, are both freaking out, okay? So in 336 BCE, Philip is assassinated by his bodyguard. And no one knows why this happened, okay? But we know what happened. Afterwards, what happened is, first of all, Olympias killed Eurydice and her daughter and son. The son was going to be legitimate heir to the throne. Now they're all dead, okay? That's the first thing that happens. Second thing that happens is Attalus becomes afraid, and he's about to rebel, okay? And Attalus, again, is a general. At this stage, at this point, Parmenion is now the kingmaker, right? Because Parmenion is now head of the army. He can choose to support Attalus, his son-in-law, and rebel, okay, and maybe become king himself, or he can support Alexander, okay? And at this point, the faithful decision that Parmenion makes is he supports Alexander and he kills Attalus. And Attalus, again, is his son-in-law. And this makes Alexander now the legitimate heir to Philip. He's now king of Macedon. Okay? So from this event, we can surmise some things, okay? The first thing we can surmise is Olympias and Alexander are extremely ambitious, right? They will not be pushed aside. If they see any risk to their power, they will act viciously, okay? They're not afraid to kill. They will even kill the king in order to assure their power. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing that's more important for us is Parmenion is absolutely loyal to Alexander because if you think about it, he's loyal to the memory of Philip. Okay? Philip promoted Parmenion to be his partner, and in a show of loyalty and gratitude, Parmenion now is being loyal to the son, Alexander. Okay, so that's the first major event in Alexander's life. Any questions about this event before I move on? Okay, so the second thing that happens is, remember, like Philip is now in charge of this wide kingdom across Greece. And when people hear about his death, people start to rebel, okay? The Athenians want to rebel. The Thebans want to rebel. The Spartans want to rebel. And then to the north, the Illyrians rebel, okay? So there are these rebellions. The first thing that Alexander does is he mounts this extremely fast and decisive campaign to quell all eternal dissent. Because ultimately, his ambition is to complete the dream of his father, the conquest of Persia, right? So he goes to Illyria, which is north to Macedonia, and destroys all opposition. Next thing he does is he marches against Greece itself, against Thebes. And Thebes is the main source of opposition. And Sparta and Athens both promised to send troops to support Thebes. The problem is Alexander gets there really fast. And he lays siege to Thebes and destroys it completely. The next thing that he does is he decides to massacre all the males and enslave all the women. Now, this is actually common practice back then in terms of warfare, but this is not done to Greek cities. Do you understand? The Greeks consider themselves special. And so in 404 BCE, when Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War, remember that Sparta did not do anything. Sparta just basically said, guys, will you promise not to bother us again? And so Athens says, we promise. That was it, okay? So what Alexander the Great did, destroying Thebes, which is one of the great cultural centers of the Greek world, that was like basically setting off a nuclear bomb, okay? And from then on, the Greeks were committed to overthrowing Alexander when the opportunity arose. At the same time, Alexander, by doing this, by showing his ruthlessness, he was able to, for now, pacify all discontent, okay? People are now afraid of him. And that's what Alexander wants. He wants fear. Okay, so now that eternal descent has been pacified, now that his leadership has been legitimized, he will now embark on the massive invasion of Persia. Okay? Now, originally his father, Philip II, his dream was a unified Greek world, okay? What we call Hellenistic, okay? Or the Hellenic world. Because remember, at this point, you have these Greek polises spread all across the Aegean and the Mediterranean, okay? In North Africa, in Italy, in Asia Minor, in Anatolia, okay? And Philip's vision was to unify all these places. But Alexander the Great, his vision was actually to conquer Persia, okay? So he's expanding his father's vision. So he lands in Anatolia, which is like modern-day Turkey, with this massive invasion force, okay? And he's going against the Persian Empire. The way that the Persian Empire is designed is, it's not really an empire, it's more like a confederation or alliance. So the provincial governors, who we call the satraps, they're the ones responsible for defending their own territory. And at this point, the king of Persia, his name is Darius III, he's not really bothered by Alexander, okay? He doesn't realize that Alexander will pose a threat to his rule, okay? He just thinks this guy, he's like 20 years old, he's an upstart, doesn't really matter. So Darius doesn't really bother himself, okay? But he sends an advisor. This guy, he's a Greek, Menon of Rhodes. So he's Greek, and he understands Greek warfare. And so they have this war council between the satraps, the local governors, and Menon of Rhodes. And what Menon of Rhodes proposes is the safest strategy to defeat Alexander, which is basically what we call a war of attrition. And the idea is they will not fight Alexander on the battlefield, because Alexander right now possesses the greatest army in the world, right? Let's not fight him. We will burn all the crops and starve his troops. At the same time, what we will do is we will bribe Athens and Sparta to rebel against Alexander. And once he's overextended, he has no choice but to go home. Okay? The war's over. Doesn't cost us anything. The satraps refuse this plan because it would mean destroying their own property. Okay? So satraps are like, no, we can overwhelm him. So at the Battle of Granicus, in 334 BCE, Alexander's forces destroy the Persians, okay? And this is the first major battle of this war. There'll be 3 major battles. What's important for us is, during this battle, Alexander displayed tremendous recklessness, okay? He rushed to the front of the battle. He led his cavalry, and he was almost overwhelmed, okay? One of the satraps knocked him down, and one of the satraps was about to kill him, slash him, okay? But then at the last minute, a man named Cleitus the Black, comes running in, and he cuts off the satrap's arm, thus saving Alexander's life, all right? So at this point, there are 2 individuals that Alexander should be most grateful for, right? Parmenion, who basically, he was a kingmaker, and he announced that the army would be always loyal to Alexander, okay? And Cleitus the Black, who saved Alexander's life in battle. And both of these men were individuals promoted heavily by his father for their talent, okay? So basically, it was his father's men that saved Alexander. So you would think Alexander would be very grateful to these men, right? Unfortunately, he would end up killing both men, and this would forever change the course of his life, okay? All right, so after the Battle of Granicus, Men of Rhodes was given complete freedom to do what he wanted, okay? So Men of Rhodes tried to stop Alexander, and when he realized he couldn't do it because Alexander's army was too powerful, Men of Rhodes set sail for Greece. And he was hoping to bribe Athens and Sparta to join the war and rebel against Alexander. And here, something that happens, and Alexander gets really lucky, okay? And we will find this in his life. He gets very lucky a lot of times. And what is it that happens when Men of Rhodes set sail for Greece? He's about to unite the Greeks and rebel against Alexander. And then remember, Athens and Sparta at this point really hates Alexander. So what happens? He dies, okay? He gets sick and he dies. And when Men of Rhodes dies, there's no more contact with the Greek world. And now Persia is left to basically defend itself, okay? The Greeks cannot be counted on. There will be Greek rebellions against Alexander, but they will be sporadic and they will not be coordinated, okay? So Darius has no choice but to confront Alexander in two massive battles. So the first massive battle is in southern Turkey, Anatolia, called the Battle of Issus, okay, in 333 BCE. The second battle will happen 2 years later in Gaugamela, in Mesopotamia. And both of these battles are about the same, okay? So I'll explain what happened in both battles so you can understand Alexander's strategy of war. All right, so usually in battles, there are three major forces. There's something called the left flank, okay, the center flank, and the right flank. And both armies are like this. Now, in both battles, the Persians heavily outnumbered the Greeks, 2-1, okay? So it's a massive difference. And the cavalry is usually on the sides. Now, there are some certain differences, okay? The first difference is the Persians have one leader, Darius. And he's in the center, being protected by his bodyguard called the Immortals. The Immortals are the best troops of the Persians, okay? The Macedonians have two leaders, Parmenion and Alexander. Alexander is in charge of the cavalry. Parmenion is in charge of the infantry, what we call the phalanx. And in both battles, the same thing happens, which is on the left side, Darius commits most of his forces against Parmenion. Okay? So Parmenion is being overwhelmed by superior numbers. But here, the discipline of Parmenion is just incredible because even though they're being overwhelmed, okay, they're being outnumbered and they're about to be outrun, they hold their ground. Okay? And then in the right, in the center, there's so much conflict that eventually what happens is there's a small gap that allows Alexander to rush to Darius, okay? Remember, Darius is being protected heavily because he's a king, right? And at this point, Alexander and his forces are overwhelming the cavalry of Darius. And they're about to close up, they're getting close to Darius. And at this point, what Darius does, and this is something you can never do in a battle. What does Darius do now? And he does this in both battles, Issus and Gaugamela. What does he do now? He sees Alexander closing in, right? But his left flank is about to overwhelm Parmenion. What does Darius do now in both battles? He runs away. Okay? And when he does that, Alexander is now free to go back and rescue Parmenion, and then the Persians flee. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so this is what happens in both battles, Issus and Gaugamela. So now that you have the basic overview of both battles, let's analyze this to ask ourselves, how great a commander is Alexander? Okay, and I want to make the argument that he's actually not a great strategist. Okay? He's a great soldier. He's very brave, but he's not a great strategist, not like his father. Okay? The first thing I will say is this. When military historians look at battles, they look at the wrong things, right? So they're usually looking at manpower, technology, and resources, okay, or what we call wealth, right? And if we look at battles from this lens, right, manpower, technology, and resources, wealth, then we can argue the Persians were heavily favored in this battle, in this war, right? We can say that. But I think this is the wrong way to look at military strategy. I think if you really want to understand who's a favorite and who's the underdog, you have to look at three different things. These three different things are cohesion. The idea of cohesion is unity, right? Are these soldiers loyal to each other? Are they friends with each other? Okay? Second thing you want to look at is discipline. How well trained are these troops? Okay? The third thing you want to look at is the idea of devotion. Devotion just means how loyal are they to their leaders? How much purpose do they have in the battle? Okay, does that make sense? And what I want to show you today is, but look at these three things. They give you a much better overview or analysis of who the better military is. Okay? So if you just look at manpower, technology, and resources, then clearly the Persians are the heavy favorites, right? But if you change your frame of reference and you will look at cohesion, discipline, and devotion, then the Macedonians are far superior, right? Because look, cohesion means they have a culture. They have a similar culture, right? They're all Greeks. Whereas the Persians are a multicultural empire that they don't even speak the same language, which means that all these different units that Darius has, they're basically fighting by themselves. So they're not coordinated, okay? Does that make sense? That's the first thing. Second thing is the idea of discipline. If you're an empire, the problem with an empire is your soldiers don't fight that many battles, right? Because you're an empire. No one's going to challenge you. So these soldiers, even though they have these very expensive armor and horses, they weren't disciplined. They didn't have experience in battle. Whereas Alexander's army is Philip's army. And for the past 30 years, all they did was fight battle after battle against the Greeks, okay? So in terms of discipline, the Greeks are far superior. And then you look at devotion. Darius is king. Why are people loyal to him? Because he pays them, right? It's profit, it's interest. Whereas the soldiers under Parmenion and Alexander, they love their leaders, right? Their leaders have taken them to lots of victories. So they're very loyal to him, okay? So just in terms of these, if you just look at cohesion, discipline, and devotion, we can predict that Alexander's army would win regardless of the strategy, okay? And now you can also make the argument that the strategy that Alexander employed, right, we will confront the Persians head on. Philip would have thought this was a stupid idea, okay? Because first of all, you're outnumbered. Second of all, you're on enemy terrain, right? You're on enemy terrain. Therefore, they are able to deploy the resources much better than you are, okay? Now, the third problem is this. The third problem is you cannot afford to retreat. Do you understand? There's no place to retreat. If your army ever breaks, right? If Parmenion gets overwhelmed, then you're all dead. Why take that risk, right? Also, before both battles, Issus and Gaugamela, Darius wanted to negotiate with Alexander. Basically, Darius said, I will give you half my empire. Right? That's pretty generous. And Alexander says, no, I need all of it. All right? So historians will tell you that Gaugamela just shows the military prowess of Alexander. And but if you analyze it properly, I think, you will see there are lots of problems with Alexander's strategy in both battles. Okay? He was taking risks that he shouldn't have. And he sacrificed a lot of men that he didn't really need to sacrifice. For Alexander, it was all about winning the war, right? Personal glory. Whereas Philip was concerned about the safety and well-being of his soldiers. So Philip would not have engaged in such a battle. He would have preferred negotiation. And then over time, slowly overwhelm Persia. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions so far about this analysis?
Quick question.
Yeah, great.
I can see this working when you are fighting a foreign power, right?
Yeah.
You said it was a very big risk for Alexander to take, turning his army against other Greek cities, right? That must put huge stresses on things like devotion, discipline, and cohesion when it's Greeks fighting Greeks as opposed to
Yeah.
Greeks fighting Persians.
Right. Okay. So, great question. So, Alexander didn't really trust the Greeks. The Greeks didn't consider the Macedonians part of. They didn't consider the Macedonians Greek. Okay. And so when Alexander when Alexander developed his invasion force of Persia, there weren't that many Greeks actually in it. It was mostly Macedonian. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. But you're right. If given what Alexander did in Thebes, he could not really trust the Greeks anymore. Okay? He couldn't really trust the Greeks, like switch sides. And also, there were a lot of Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius in this battle. Menon of Rhodes was Greek. Okay? And he sort of knew the Greeks really didn't like Alexander.
So it's more like a tribal army rather than an imperial army.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Okay? But again, we see this throughout history where a tribal army, because of cohesion, discipline, and devotion, they're basically able to conquer the world, right? So you look. Yeah. So you look at Muhammad, you look at Genghis Khan, right? And you look at Tamerlane, you look at a lot of people, right? They were all tribal armies, but because they had cohesion, discipline, and devotion, they were able to basically conquer most of the world before they themselves devolved into civil war. Okay? So does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, any more questions before I continue? Okay. Okay, so while Alexander was campaigning against Persia, he was doing things that sort of annoyed his soldiers, okay? So for example, he conquered Egypt without much resistance, okay? So he went to Egypt. And basically, the Egyptians hated the Persians. For decades, for centuries, the Egyptians were trying to rebel against Persia without success. So when Alexander came, they saw him as a liberator. So Egypt fell without resistance. The first thing that Alexander does is he takes a trip into the desert. He disappears for weeks. And he goes to a place called the Temple of Zeus Ammon. Ammon is the highest Egyptian god, and Zeus is the highest Greek god. So they are like a synthesis, okay? So this is the highest god in the world. And this is found in an isolated oasis. And Alexander goes to this oasis in order to seek counsel. He wants to see his future. And when he's at the temple of Zeus Ammon, he's told that Philip is not really his father. Okay? Philip is not really his father. Alexander's true father is, take a wild guess who the true father is. Zeus Ammon, right? Alexander is the first son of God, right? He's the son of God. He's like Heracles and Dionysus. He's actually the son of God. And so when Alexander returns to his soldiers after this revelation, he expects his soldiers to acknowledge this fact, okay? So one thing is, in the Macedonian army, there's a lot of equality between soldiers and officers, right? So if you're a soldier, you are allowed to speak your mind. But now, Alexander demands, if you come into his presence, you must first kiss his feet, which is the Persian custom, okay? You must kiss the feet of your king. And the Macedonians, of course, didn't really like this. So now there's growing concern about the tyranny of Alexander, okay? People like Parmenion and Cleitus the Black, who were promoted heavily by his father, are kind of annoyed. Basically, Alexander renounced his father. Philip's not really my father. I'm really the son of a god, okay? Zeus Ammon. So, okay. So now there's growing discontent among his soldiers. Does that make sense so far? And any questions before I move on? Is this clear to you? Okay. All right. So, in 331 BCE, Gaugamela, the Battle of Gaugamela happens, and Alexander wins this incredible victory against the Persian king Darius. Darius runs away, but then he's eventually killed by one of his generals. Okay, and the Persian Empire now is basically conquered. There's no resistance against Alexander anymore. There's some resistance, but not organized resistance. Okay, and at this point, Alexander starts being a tyrant. Okay, so the first major sign that he's changing is in 330 BCE, Parmenion is killed. Remember, Parmenion, you can argue, was the man responsible for all of Alexander's victories, right? Because Parmenion is the one who's doing all the heavy lifting. He's being overwhelmed by most of Persian forces. He stands his ground, which allows Alexander to claim his victory, okay? In 330 BCE, Alexander orders Parmenion to be killed. And there's a lot of controversy around what happened, right? So I'll just basically tell you the basic facts, and then we'll analyze what happened. So there's a lot of resentment against Alexander in the army. And now and then there are these conspiracies. They don't go anywhere, but there are these conspiracies amongst officers to assassinate Alexander. And one of these conspiracies is found out, and one of the officers who finds out about this conspiracy goes to Parmenion's son, okay? And tells the son, hey, go tell the king people are trying to assassinate him. The son, Parmenion's son, he doesn't think this is a big deal. And he's kind of drunk, okay? So he forgets to tell Alexander, okay? The plot is uncovered, and the son, Cleitus, he's implicated, and he's tortured. He had nothing to do with the assassination, but he's implicated because he didn't tell Alexander. While he's being tortured, he also confesses to his father being part of the plot, even though there's no evidence implicating his father. In fact, you can make the argument that his father is completely loyal to Alexander. Okay? And so just based on this, a forced confession under torture, which is completely unreliable, Alexander and the army decide to have Parmenion killed. Okay? So an assassin is sent, and Parmenion is killed. Now, these are the basic facts, and there's a lot of argument about what happened. Okay? So the most generous argument, the most generous interpretation is Alexander didn't want Parmenion killed. He knows Parmenion is innocent, but because Alexander was forced to kill his son, Cleitus, Alexander didn't feel he had a choice in the matter, okay? Because Parmenion might want revenge. So to maintain stability and peace within the army, he had to get Parmenion killed, okay? That's the most generous explanation. But there's another explanation that makes more sense, which is Alexander has always been jealous of Parmenion, right? Because Parmenion has the most legitimacy in the army. Troops feel more loyal to Parmenion than they do to Alexander, right? Because Parmenion, they're more experienced with Parmenion than with Alexander. And Parmenion was responsible for many great triumphs. So Alexander was jealous of Parmenion. Also, there were these new young officers who wanted to climb the ranks. And to do so, they need to get rid of people like Parmenion, right? So maybe the conspiracy was a fake conspiracy, and it was organized by these low officers to implicate Cleitus, and then in order to get rid of Parmenion, okay? But regardless of how you interpret this, what we do know is after Parmenion was killed, basically all the shackles, all the restraints on Alexander went away. because there's no one in the because now there's no one in the army who can resist Alexander. Okay, there's no one who can basically urge restraint and caution. So the next thing that happens is this: in the year 328, Cleitus the Black is killed. Remember, Cleitus the Black is the person who saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus. Okay. But Cleitus the Black, again, he is a loyal officer promoted by his father. And now Cleitus the Black has the same authority as Parmenion once had. So Cleitus the Black is now a threat to Alexander. So what Alexander does is he basically orders Cleitus the Black to take some soldiers and go off to a faraway place. It's basically exiled, okay? Alexander is basically exiling him from the main army. And Cleitus the Black knows, basically, he's finished. So before Cleitus the Black is meant to go into exile, they have a large banquet, okay? And they're all drunk. And Cleitus the Black now is angry. And he gets into a vicious argument with Alexander. And Cleitus the Black basically says to Alexander, "You've betrayed your people, the Macedonians. You've come to Persia, and you could only conquer Persia with our help. And now you're turning into a Persian. Okay? You're adopting Persian customs, like forcing your officers to kiss your feet. You're promoting Persian officers within your army. Okay? You're turning your back away from the culture that made you great." Then he says something that really pisses Alexander off. What is one thing that you can say to Alexander that would really piss him off? In fact, he would want to kill you now. Everything that you've achieved, Alexander, is because of your father. This is not you, okay? This conquest of Persia, it's not you. It's your father. It's your father who built this amazing army. It's your father who developed this plan to conquer Persia. Okay? Alexander gets so angry that he's about to lunge at Cleitus the Black, okay? But before he can do so, his bodyguard surrounds him and stops him, and they pull away his sword. And so this makes us think he's been doing this a lot, okay? Alexander the Great gets drunk a lot and kills a lot of people, basically. And then Cleitus the Black, he's taken out of the room. But Cleitus the Black is so strong, he forces himself back in the room. He starts to continue arguing against Alexander. Alexander then goes and takes a spear and throws it at Cleitus the Black, killing him on the spot. So Cleitus the Black is now dead. The two men who are most responsible for Alexander's victories in Persia are now both dead. Okay? And he's becoming more and more of a tyrant. Soon afterwards, there's a conspiracy. There's a real conspiracy to kill him. What happens is this, okay? The king, Alexander, goes on a boar hunt with his pages, okay, his servants. Now, the custom in Persia is the king has the right to the first kill. But his pages are Macedonians, so they don't know this. So one of the pages is the first to kill the boar. Alexander is so angry, he beats the crap out of this page. And the pages get together that night, and they resolve to kill this tyrant. And they organize a schedule so that on one night, they would be all in the bedroom looking after Alexander while he sleeps. And then of course, they would take out their daggers and stab Alexander to death. Okay? That's the plan. But what happens is, that night, they were supposed to do this act. Alexander goes out drinking. And he gets drunk, and he does not come back until the early morning when the pages are gone. Okay? At this point, one of the pages gets nervous and tells Alexander about the conspiracy, and Alexander has everyone killed. Okay? But during the trial, the pages accuse Alexander of being a tyrant. Okay? Does that make sense? Then what happens is, in 326 BCE, after Alexander has conquered all of Persia, he decides to take his army to India. Okay? Now his army is not happy about this because, look, there are lots of good reasons to invade Persia, right? The first reason is Persia is very wealthy. Second reason is Persia invaded Greece, right? So Persia was always a threat to the Greek mainland. The third reason is there are lots of people who suspect it was the Persians who killed Philip, okay? So there are lots of good reasons to invade Persia. There's absolutely no reason to invade India, okay? They've never been to India. They have absolutely no idea what they will find in India. It's a different geography, okay? But Alexander forces his army to invade India, in basically modern-day Pakistan. And there, they win these victories, but the soldiers are really pissed off because they're far away from home. They have absolutely no idea when this war will end. And the weather in India really sucks, okay? So they basically mutiny. They refuse to fight. And Alexander, at this point, has no choice but to give in to but to retreat, okay? To return back to Babylon. But he does two things to show his anger. The first thing he does is he kills all the leaders of the mutiny, okay? Those who spoke up on behalf of their fellow soldiers were all killed one by one. Second thing that happens is rather than take his soldiers back the original way, Alexander made them march through a desert, which killed many of them, okay? Many died because of dehydration and starvation. It was a brutal march across the desert. So Alexander takes his army back to Babylon. And at this point, Alexander decides he can't invade India, so he'll go invade Arabia. Okay? He'll go invade Arabia, which is desert. There's a reason why no one invaded Arabia, and the reason why it's all desert. There's no reason to invade Arabia. But Alexander wants to be the first to conquer Arabia because his ambition is boundless, okay? He has to prove he's the greatest conqueror in the world. The only way we can do that is by conquering the entire world. He's very suspicious of his own soldiers because they mutiny against him in India, right? So he's starting to replace his army with Persians who are much more obedient. He wants obedience. Then something else happens. Back in Macedonia, the general in charge, Antipater, who again is one of Philip's most loyal generals, he gets in an argument with Olympias. Okay, Olympias, as his mother, and Antipater don't see eye to eye. And Olympias tells Alexander, and Alexander invites Antipater to Babylon, where they will settle matters. Okay, and Antipater knows what happened to Parmenion. He knows what happened to Cleitus the Black. And at this point, most of Alexander's generals are unhappy with the fact that the army is being Persianized, right? They're being replaced by Persian officers who are more loyal to Alexander. So in 323, Alexander dies. And again, no one will ever know what actually happened. But the theory is this, okay? I think the theory that makes the most sense is basically the top echelon of the Macedonian army, Antipater and the other generals, basically decided Alexander has to go because he's a tyrant. And eventually, he's going to kill everyone. Okay? So what happened was there was a banquet, and Antipater's son, he's the cupbearer to Alexander, the person who pours the drinks to Alexander during meals. The son puts poison in the cup. Alexander drinks from it, and he starts to vomit, okay? So Alexander leaves the room to vomit. And then the son, Antipater's son, brings a feather laced with more poison to help Alexander vomit some more, okay? And so Alexander should have died on the spot. But Alexander is so tough, he's such a strong man, that he lasts for a few more weeks, okay? And he dies in bed. So Alexander now is dead. Okay? Okay, this is important because even though he's dead, in the 10 years that he's been around, he's been able to conquer most of the world, which includes Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Okay? He's able to conquer most of the known world. And this creates a problem for the generals who succeed him, right? Because once you conquer most of this world, and then remember, the plan was not to conquer most of the world. It was just Alexander's boundless ambition that made them do so, okay? Now the question is, how do you govern? And so because of this pressure, they had no choice but to develop something called Greek culture and spread it in order to create legitimacy for themselves. Okay? And this is something that we will talk about next class, which will conclude our section on the Greeks. Okay? The legacy of Alexander. He's conquered the world, and now his generals must govern it. And to govern it, they must use something called Greek culture. So they must invent Greek culture and then spread it around the world. And when they do so, what will happen is the Greek culture will merge with local cultures to create new ideas. Okay? Greek culture, one of these cultures that Greek culture will merge with is called Judaism. Judaism. And when these two cultures merge, a new idea will emerge from this mixture called Christianity that changes the world forever. Okay? That's why Christians love Alexander the Great, because they feel that without his conquest, Christianity could not have been born, okay? So there are many Christians who feel like Alexander the Great, yeah, he was a tyrant, but he was part of God's plan. It was all part of the plan. He did what he did because he truly is the son of Zeus Ammon, and Zeus Ammon commanded him to conquer the world. Okay? All right? But again, that is a Christian perspective. All right, so that is it, okay? So let's review what we did today. We basically looked at this analytical model, and we made three predictions about Alexander based on this analytical model, right? The first is that he would focus on expansion. Second is he would become a tyrant. The third is that he would never stop expanding. And it turns out he was exactly like this, okay? But this predicts his life and times. All right? So, any questions? Okay, so next class, what we will do is we will look at the spreading of Greek culture and the building of the Hellenistic world. Okay, and that will end our section on the Greeks.